Survivors, Flood, Mississippi, 1927, Chapter 13. At first Molly had been able to do nothing besides cling to the tree trunk, her face pressed against the bark. Then she had shouted for Garrett, but he hadn't answered her. Every time lightning split the sky she flinched, and the thunder seemed to shake her very soul. She could not see Garrett or the raft. The lightning got closer. The flood water was lit like a flawed mirror with every crackling bolt. She squeezed her eyes shut against the image of the water surface, cluttered with the floating remains of homes and lives. Was Marysville gone now, too? Molly thought about her family and clenched her fists, sending a fierce, pleading prayer heavenward. Then she rose up on her knees and tried shouting Garrett's name again. The lightning gave her irregular glimpses of the water around her, but the rolling thunder swallowed her cries. Molly felt a shudder go through the tree trunk, and she sat bolt upright, thinking for a moment that lightning had struck dangerously close. But there was no flash of light, nor a smell of burnt wood. She shifted her weight to her knees and rocked back on her heels. A second shudder went through the tree. She heard an odd groaning sound and scrambled forward to grab a broken branch that jutted up at an angle from the broad trunk. The branch seemed to be moving downward a few inches, and she readjusted her feet to keep her balance. "It's turning," Molly whispered to herself, as if hearing her the tree rolled a little farther to one side. Molly imagined the underwater half of the big old magnolia, its reaching branches spreading far enough to touch the muddy bottom, the water around it not quite deep enough to float it. Was the current strong enough to roll it like a wheel? The next flash of lightning showed Molly a swelling that connected 3 of the knuckles on her left hand. It looked grotesque, but she felt no pain as she shifted her grip to another branch. The tree moved in little jerks, rolling over so far that Molly had to scramble sideways to keep from being carried into the water. On the upstream side, branches churned and rose, thrashing above her head like a leafy Ferris wheel. Molly hung on instinctively as the branch she held onto lifted, then arced downward. She gasped in a deep breath the instant before she plunged into the river. She let go of the branch, feeling leaves and twigs whip at her legs and back as she tried to swim clear of the rolling tree. A glancing blow on her shoulder slowed Molly, but she swam desperately, struggling to reach the surface. All around her the water roiled with slicing branches and leaves that stung her face and confused her. Kicking frantically, fighting to keep away from the tree, Molly didn't feel the odd tug at the back of her shift at first. Then her collar tightened around her throat, and she felt herself being pulled backward. The tree had caught hold of her, and it was dragging her deeper. Molly flailed at the water, twisting, wrenching around, then trying to reach behind herself with both hands. Her fingertips brushed the bow that held her captive, but she couldn't get a grip on it. Panicked, kicking, she managed to hook one foot over a thick branch. She shoved hard and felt her collar begin to tear. Bracing both feet, she shoved herself backward, and the cloth gave way. Desperate, lungs aching, she swam toward the surface. Stark, silver veins of lightning lit the sky as Molly's face burst into the cool afternoon air. For a few seconds she could only breathe. The air was sweet. It was delicious. Her thoughts spun giddily as she treaded water, turning to face the tree. As she watched, it rolled onward, churning the water to foam as it moved downstream. Molly waited for another flash of lightning to search for something that would serve her as a float. Debris dotted the river, but none of it was close, and it was hard to tell boards from downed trees or dead farm animals in the rain-grayed light. Her arms beginning to ache, Molly turned a slow circle in the water. A line of standing tree-tops caught her eye. Not knowing what else to do, she swam toward them. The 4th tree had a limb level enough for her to rest upon. She hugged the trunk, shivering and miserable as the rain thickened into another downpour. Then, through the sound of the storm, she heard Garrett's voice. It was faint and distant and unmistakable. She struggled to her feet and shouted in answer. "Molly!" Garrett shouted, whirling to face the sound of her voice and very nearly tipping the raft. Her answer was faint but distinct, and he began pulling toward the sound of her voice. "Garrett!" This time he could hear how desperate she sounded. He answered her, and she shouted back again. He felt a knot deep inside her begin to loosen, and he pulled fast, no longer feeling the chill of the rain or the sharp stab of pain in his right hand every time he touched the bottom and pushed forward. The lightning was moving farther and farther away as the rain let up. taking the rumbling thunder with it. Garrett squinted upward. It had to be late in the day, maybe even early evening. Even though it had come only in flashes, the lightning had made it possible for him to see downriver a ways. Now that it was gone, he was aware of how he had been depending on it to pick his way through the debris in the water. He followed the sound of Molly's voice, calling back to her every time she shouted. He bumped into a floating oil drum and had to slow to maneuver past it. When he looked up again, he realized that Molly's shouts were leading him toward a stand of drowned trees. "Garrett! I'm in the gum tree, the big one. Can you see me?" His eyes followed the sound of her voice. He brought the raft around, pulling steadily until he was directly beneath her. For a moment they just stared at each other, grinning. "You look like a drowned rat," she said. "You look like a rat that drowned last week," he teased back. Molly's smile dimmed and went out. "I've never been this scared." "Me either," he admitted. Molly climbed down, stepping shakily onto the raft as he steadied her. They both sat down quickly to keep the raft from tilting beneath them. He used his pole to push against the tree, turning downriver. "You rest a while. I'll see how far I can get us before dark." Molly sat on the raft, running her hand lightly over the wood, smiling as though she were delighted to see an old friend. "If you give out, I'll take a turn," she said. Garrett nodded, an odd tightness in his throat. If they ever made it home, he was going to tell Willard and Earl that Molly Bride had more courage than they would ever have put together. Times 10.